Please welcome to the stage Alexandria Villaseñor and Elizabeth Yeampierre in conversation with Nandita Raghuram.
Okay. Oh, Nandita, that's on the side. All right, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here and to be joined by Alexandria and Elizabeth. Today we're talking about climate change, of course, but I think a lot of people in this room can relate to a feeling that I have personally sometimes of that climate change just feels like this huge insurmountable problem with no end in sight. But that's why I think it's so great to see the work that you two are doing. You guys both are on the front lines of the climate change movement. You both are taking action every single day against the climate crisis. I wanted to start today's conversation by having you each kind of go through how you began your work. Alexandria, I'll start with you. When you first started skipping school for climate change, what motivated you?
Yeah, so first of all, hi everyone, and thank you so much for having me here today. I've been on climate strike every Friday for the past 41 weeks in front of the United Nations headquarters in solidarity with Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement. And what had really gotten me involved in being a climate activist was I was visiting family back in Northern California, where I was born and raised, when the Paradise Fire broke out. And so Paradise Fire quickly became the worst wildfire in California history. Many people died and many homes were destroyed. And so my family's home was so close to Paradise. We had gotten a lot of the smoke. It, at one point, was the worst air quality in the world. And since the smoke was seeping into my house, I had to roll up wet towels, put them under windows and doors to keep the smoke from coming in. It was an unsafe situation because it was inflaming my asthma. And so my family had to send me back to New York City early. And at that point, I was really upset and I wanted to do something. And I started to research the effects of the climate crisis, and I saw the connection between California's wildfires and climate change. So I wanted to do something because I saw the effects of the climate crisis in my community, but communities all around the world. And so I didn't really know what to do until I saw Greta Thunberg speak at COP24. And seeing her had really just empowered me to go out and join her climate striking the last day of COP24, December 14th. And that was my first form of activism because I wanted to protect communities all around the world.
Elizabeth, what about you? Was there a specific moment or event that kind of spurred you to take charge?
Well, buenas tardes, everyone. I have been a social justice activist most of my life, but in 1996 I came to Uprose and young people came in who were suffering from asthma and respiratory disease and wanted us to engage in environmental justice. And I think that started my trajectory, we've organized 7 climate justice youth summits. We had one this weekend which featured Frontline youth from all over the United States that have been working at the intersection of racial injustice and climate change all of their lives because their survival is at stake. And so the organization really became an intergenerational organization with young people on the board of directors, on staff, this understanding that leadership is a continuum and that you exercise it throughout and that we learn from each other across the table. And so I think since 1996, I've been working on environmental justice and climate justice. And a few years ago, I had the honor of becoming the co-chair of the Climate Justice Alliance, which is a national alliance of networks and alliances from Puerto Rico all the way to Guam that really incorporates frontline solutions. So it's been a tremendous journey. And we have done amazing things that we didn't expect, everything from launching a community-owned solar cooperative to doubling open space and stopping pipelines and power plants, and it's all been done intergenerationally. So I think that, but it really just started with young people walking into the office and saying, we can't breathe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting. You two both mentioned this connection to asthma and the difficulties breathing. It's clear that climate change is impacting people's bodies on a very personal level. I'm wondering if you both could talk through some concrete goals you'd like to achieve. Alexandria, I'll start with you.
So some of the concrete goals that I'd like to achieve with my activism is getting climate action from world leaders. And so that's why a lot of students had striked this past Friday, September 20th, It was a global climate strike where an estimate of 4 million people and counting internationally went on school strike for climate, demanding action from world leaders. And so a lot of our demands were targeted at the United Nations Climate Action Summit that will be happening this Monday. And what we really wanted to see, the goals we wanted to see happen was we want a reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions, a just transition to renewable energy, but also we want world leaders to hold polluters accountable because we believe those who are causing our planet to heat up really need to be held accountable for violating our rights.
Elizabeth, concrete goals?
Sure. So before I talk about the concrete goals, I want to say that in New York State, we have passed the most aggressive climate legislation in the world. And to make New York State 100% renewable, and to have a polluter penalty. And so I think our goal definitely to operationalize what a just transition is, to move people away from fossil fuel extraction to regenerative energy, to stop the dig, burn, and dump economy. And you know, our mantra is keep it in the ground. And so anything that basically takes us away from extraction and creates an economy that takes us to where we have to be and is fast-paced is part of our national platform.
Yeah, Elizabeth, you described your work as intergenerational. I'm wondering why you think it's important to have young people like Alexandria work together with people from other generations.
Well, so I don't believe that young people are the future. I don't believe they have to postpone leadership. I think they have to exercise it now. And I do think that when we're working with each other, we learn from each other. I certainly am better at social media. I have an understanding of what the challenges that young people are facing because I'm at the table with them. When they're at the table with me, they have an opportunity to learn about all the experiences I've had from being in boardrooms and being in places that they might have been. And what it does is it speeds up their ability to move faster and more nimbly. If they have to wait to learn it, and if we're gatekeepers and we keep all of the information and we don't share it, their ability to be able to move as fast as they have to in the age of climate change is going to be blunted. So it's in our interest and it's in their interest for us to be able to work with each other in a way that's intergenerational. And the other thing is that, you know, community is intergenerational and power has to be intergenerational. A lot of the campaigns that our organization has pushed have come because young people thought they were important. There was a time when I was trying to work to double open space in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, because we had a 1/4 acre of open space for every 1,000 people living there and so many young people with health issues. And their priority was fighting the siting of a power plant. And so we did that and they won. And for a 15-year-old to be able to say that they shut down the siting, that they stopped the siting of a power plant is amazing. It's amazing, like the young people at Standing Rock who basically really stood for justice to stop the pipeline. We don't think of youth leadership as a pipeline. We call it a vine. Because a vine has deep roots and grows in a lot of different directions, and they are integral to leadership. They're not a program. We don't think about them in terms of what do the young people think. We think about how do we build the bigger we, and the bigger we requires that young people be at the table.
Yeah, absolutely. Alexandria, kind of a similar question. Is there something that you want to see from people from other generations when it comes to climate change?
Really, I think from other generations, what I would like to see from them, especially the older generations, is the help and the advocating for us, because adults are able to amplify the students' message, and they are the best adult allies out there when they're amplifying our message and they're supporting us in our activism. And when we're taking direct action and we're going on strikes, protecting us when they're marshalling, and really they do help us out momentally. And so I think from younger generations, I think that it's so amazing to see students starting to really, who are maybe 10 years old, are starting to really see the climate science and they're starting to see the education, and they want to get involved as much as they can too. And seeing the younger generations too are starting to really want to stand up and fight with all of the students who are now is very empowering to see. Mm-hmm.
Switching gears a little bit, I'm wondering, Elizabeth, if you could kind of talk through how climate change and the climate justice movement intersects with racial justice.
You know, for us, it's all about racial justice. The truth is that the global South is going to be and is being impacted more than any other place or any other places. We're talking about Puerto Rico, we're talking about the Bahamas, Bangladesh, the global south exists here in the United States. So we saw what happened with Katrina and how communities were treated there. And these are communities, if you look at communities like Katrina, like NOLA, and you look at communities in Houston, these are communities that are surrounded by petrochemical industries that have been breathing in all of the toxics and toxicants for generations, that have been fighting against the siting of the environmental burdens that have been basically causing death in our communities and health disparities. And so you combine that with ICE, and you combine that with police abuse, and you combine that with all of the things that communities of color here in the United States are faced with, and you add climate change to that. And you know that when there is one extreme weather event, the result in terms of how people respond may be good, but when we have recurrent extreme weather events, that tests whether or not people are engaged in building just relationships, and whether or not frontline communities are going to be prioritized. So for example, when you think about the climate movement right now, and you think about the events of the last few days, really important to look at whether or not the media is lifting the struggles on the front line, and who's leading them, and who's been leading them for generations. And if we're erased from that story, then the attention that is required to basically address the legacy of extraction of both our land and our bodies does not get addressed. And so a commitment to addressing climate change isn't just a commitment to thinking about renewable energy, isn't just about thinking about how you put infrastructure on the ground. It's also a commitment about how do we build just relationships, engage in self-transformation, and understand that at the center of all of this is what happens to frontline communities, and how we make sure that frontline communities and their solutions, which are just transitions, are centered.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously these communities are on the front line of the climate. They're being impacted by climate change in a very direct level. But I'm also wondering, how do we ensure that these communities aren't left out of the broader conversation, the media? Just make sure that they are front and center.
Yeah, and front and center doesn't mean that people speak for us. We can speak for ourselves. We could tell our stories. And if you look at, for example, one of our 18-year-olds just came out in an op-ed in Newsweek this week. And our young people, we were trying really hard to make sure that they had access to communications that would lift the work that they've been doing, because they're invisible. They come after school, they don't come from privilege, they don't have money. For them to come and volunteer after school every day, to be available on weekends to do art builds, to basically educate the community about climate change, that's a sacrifice. And that's a sacrifice particularly for frontline youth who don't have the economic supports to make that possible. And their stories have to be told, and shine has to be put on those stories, because that is a story about transformation, and that's a legacy of resistance that has always existed in our communities. For them, climate change is not a trend. It's not a new sexy issue. For them, it's survival, and they've experienced it personally, whether it's Superstorm Sandy, whether it's Hurricane Harvey in Houston, or whether it's Irma in Miami. Those are frontline communities that are being directly impacted right now, and those are young people that have been doing the work for a minute. So I would ask all of you to make sure that you lift up their stories and that you put some shine on them, because that's a story of transformation.
Yeah. Alexandria, similar question. How do you do that work? How do you ensure that you're lifting up those stories and the climate change movement actions that you're working on?
Definitely. I do think that people of color need to be really the ones leading this movement, because they're experiencing the effects frontline, their frontline communities, and they know what needs to happen the most. And so I work a lot, my organization Earth Uprising works a lot in the Global South. So our Nigerian ambassador, Oladosu, actually, she was supposed to come to the United Nations Youth Climate Summit, the first ever one that happened yesterday, but sadly her visa was delayed. And that happened a lot with the global youth, sadly, who are coming from other countries. But really, when talking with her and what's happening in her community, she talked about how they're experiencing mass floods that sweep away their crops. They're experiencing heat waves where they have to sleep outside, and they're experiencing an epidemic of meningitis. And so when talking with her, she said how what her community really needs is they need to know why it's happening, because none of them understand why it's happening to their community. They don't understand the climate science yet. And so making sure that they're being taught climate change and what's happening in their community and how they can combat it, is what's really important. That's what my organization, Earth Uprising, really focuses on.
Yeah, you mentioned ways different communities are being impacted by climate change, and I think obviously climate change is really impacting people on a very local level, and it kind of mimics the ways that actions and demonstrations are also happening on a local level. But I'm kind of wondering how you make sure that these actions and these local demonstrations have local impact, but also a national and international impact.
Yes, so really acting locally but thinking globally is what I do a lot of the times. For example, the second ever global climate strike was on May 24th, and it was a follow-up to a national climate strike that happened on May 3rd. So on May 3rd, students in New York City had a sit-in on the Brooklyn Bridge with over 2,000 students demanding that the New York City mayor declared a climate emergency. And so, of course, he didn't that day, but we were very excited to see that the New York City Council had drafted a resolution for a climate emergency. And so the students knew that they needed more of our help to get that passed. So with the second global climate strike on May 24th, we had 5,000 students have a die-in in Times Square, still pushing for that climate emergency. And so on June 26th, with the student strikers and all of the New York City organizations, we got this climate emergency passed. But what it really showed is it showed an example to other cities all across the country and students all around the world what they can do in their communities and how when they have a common goal, they can really push for that change. And so that's what we continue to do, is do that local level that really sets an example that others can follow and do in their own communities.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I know a lot of your work has been in Sunset Park in Brooklyn, but I'm wondering, how do you make sure that the changes, the really incredible changes that you've seen in that community, how do you make sure that those changes have a national and international impact?
So Uprose is a member of the Climate Justice Alliance and the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. You know, our folks have marched they marched with Berta Cáceres, they've been in Brazil, they've supported the indigenous people, people from the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. So we work nationally and we work internationally as well. But we try to create models that are replicable. So for example, recently when we launched the first community-owned solar cooperative in the state of New York, really proud of that. We wanted to make sure that we documented everything we learned. We had this big vision and we didn't know how to do it, but we knew we were going to do it. We were going to operationalize it. So we've been documenting our learnings about what does governance look like, how do you finance it, how do you get pre-development costs, and how do you capture all of these things so that you can share it with other communities so that we can literally start seeing this all over our communities. When we started talking about offshore wind, we talked about how can the New York City Economic Development Corporation, instead of following the market, create the market. How can we make sure, instead of getting the parts from Europe that will come by barges to create offshore wind, how do we make sure that we grow that economy here in the United States so that that creates a lot of jobs, right? So everything that we do, every single initiative is an opportunity to be part of a leaderful community. We don't believe in one iconic leader. We believe in being leaderful and share power and resources with each other so that our learnings can be literally shared. So we are in communication with each other all the time. So New York City is talking to the folks in Richmond, California, and in Detroit, and in Texas. We are constantly sharing strategies, technical information, and information in a very intergenerational way so that we can amplify and multiply the solutions that are local.
Yeah. To kind of close out our conversation and bring it back to what I mentioned in the beginning, you know, climate change does feel sometimes like this huge insurmountable problem. So I'm wondering if you both could kind of talk through a response you would say to people who say that it's, you know, striking doesn't matter, it doesn't do anything. What would you say to something like that?
I guess what I would really say to people who say striking doesn't do anything is that it really has in the past year. The Fridays for Future movement has only been around for only a year because we're coming up to COP25 now. And so when the OPEC industry calls the youth movement the #1 threat to the oil industry, you really can see how the movement has created a difference, and it's really changed the conversation around the climate crisis. And for a lot of the students too, it helps us feel emotionally better because we're dealing with all this climate and anxiety, eco-grief. And so when we take that direct action, when we strike, it helps us feel like we have a say in our future. Especially me, I'm only 14, so I can't vote yet, and I won't be able to for many years. And when I can, it will be too late to solve the climate crisis or mitigate it. And so striking is one of the best ways to really make ourselves feel better, but to get change all around the world.
Yeah, Elizabeth, what about you? Same question.
So since I'm older, we're going to go a little further back. And I'm going to say that if there hadn't been bottom-up organizing, if there hadn't been people on the streets, a lot of us wouldn't be here right now. We are what they envisioned. We are what they imagined. And had there been no civil rights movement, I wouldn't have had an education. That everything happens on the ground, and that is absolutely powerful and transformational. And that folks do that to basically diminish what you're doing, and we just have to ignore them because we know that that's where power is. So absolutely, everything on the ground makes all the difference. And they may pretend it makes no difference, but it is being heard all over the world. And so you got to keep that up. Yes.
That's an amazing note to end on. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.